Welcome back to Idiot Mystic, probably the only podcast that acknowledges we're being gaslit by the fourth dimension. It's officially 2026. Well, it has been for a while. I finally did it. I finally finished a book that haunted my teenage dreams, Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia. I remember being a teenager in the 2000s, standing in a weird used bookstore, staring at the cover. You know what I'm talking about, the psychedelic red rock archway thing with that eerie yellowish glow. It looked like a portal to me. I wanted to believe it was a map to something bigger, but I never ended up buying the book. But here I am in 2026, a fully grown idiot mystic, and I've realized that Vallee wasn't writing about space at all. After finally reading the book that I had heard so much about, I've realized he was writing about us and the others who have been living in our peripheral vision since we were living in caves. Before we dive into the deep end of the Magonian swimming pool, we should probably talk about who Jacques Vallée is. It's not some conspiracy theorist living in a van, though I guess you could say I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I watch a lot of van life videos, so I don't know what that means. But he was an eminent scientist and mathematician who was actually consulted by NASA. That's the first weird detail. A guy trusted by the space agency basically wrote a book saying, hey, maybe they aren't coming from space. Vallée's core thesis is that there is an absolutely consistent tradition of visitations from another world, a world he calls Magonia. But he argues that the visitations are interpreted through the prevailing beliefs of each era. 1,000 years ago, there were fairies, elves, or demons. In 1897, there were airship pilots with goggles and wrenches. In the 1960s, there were spacemen in shiny suits. And today, in 2026, we probably see them as interdimensional glitches or simulation administrators. For me, this is awesome, because it means the universe has a theater department. Vallee suggests that beneath the superficial differences, there is a fundamental similarity of experience. Whether you're a medieval midwife being dragged into a fairy knoll, or a 20th century driver being pulled into a metallic craft, the script is basically the same. In the 2020s, we've become obsessed with simulation theory, the idea that we're all just code in some kind of grand program. Vallee was one of the grandfathers of this idea. He saw the UFO not as a vehicle, but as a control system, or a functioning lie, as he put it, that was designed to shape our imagination over centuries. You could say the real weirdness is how arrogant we are right now. We think we're so much smarter than our ancestors. For the most part, we laugh at them for believing in trolls, while we sit here in 2026 taking blurry photos of UAPs and calling them trans-medium entities. Vallee is basically patting us on the head and saying, you're all seeing the same thing, you're just changing the labels. It's like reality itself is playing a giant game of dress-up, and we're the only ones who don't know it's a costume. Vallee doesn't just call Magonia a place. He refers to it as a parallel universe that coexists with ours, made visible and tangible only to selected people. He even suggests it might be the fourth dimension, a term that sounds scientific, but as Vallee notes, makes as much sense as saying elfland to a person who is actually experiencing it. Somehow I find comfort in the prankster-like nature of the universe. Vallee's main observation in this section of the book is what he calls the logic of the absurd. He argues that the behavior of UFO entities is consistently absurd and their appearances are ludicrous, which serves a very specific purpose. It acts as a control system that keeps serious professional scientists away. If an event is too stupid to be true, science won't touch it, which allows the phenomenon to bypass our logic and go straight to our imaginations. I don't think anything proves this better than the great airship wave of 1897. On April 22nd, 1897, in Rockland, Texas, a farmer named John M. Barclay was awakened by his dog barking and saw a peculiar oblong ship with wings and brilliant lights sitting in his pasture. He grabbed his Winchester, because it's Texas, and went to investigate. He was met there by a man who identified himself as, I'm not kidding, Smith. Smith doesn't want to talk about the stars. He wants tools. He asks Barclay for some lubricating oil, a couple of cold chisels, and some bluestone. Smith hands him a $10 bill and tells him to keep the change. When Barclay asks where they're from, Smith gives the ultimate creepy guy answer. From anywhere. But then he adds that they will be in Greece day after tomorrow. Imagine being some kind of interdimensional traveler who can manipulate space-time, yet you're stuck in a Texas cornfield because you forgot your cold chisels. Before we leave the 19th century, we have to look at how these ships were actually built. In November 1896, hundreds of people in San Francisco saw a dark, elongated object with brilliant searchlights. But the really interesting detail comes from Alexander Hamilton, who described a craft with turbine wheels and a glass section where strange beings were visible, looking down at the bewildered humans below. Think about that for a second. In 1896, they didn't have monitors or sensors. They had glass windows. The Magonian prop department basically said, "What's the most high-tech thing a Victorian can imagine? I guess a glass balcony in the sky. Let's build that." Let's go back to the year 1211 in Cloera, Ireland. The sources tell us that during Sunday Mass, an anchor dropped from a ship in the sky and caught on the church door. The congregation rushed out and saw a man swim down from the ship through the air as if he were in water. I think the bishop gave the most idiot mystic order in history. He forbade the people from holding the man because he feared the man might kill himself or suffocate. The man swam back up, the rope was cut, and the ship sailed away. Another version of the story, from Gravesend, England, ends even more tragically. The man actually died of suffocation because our atmosphere was apparently too thin for him. You could say this is the ultimate proof that Magonia has its own physics. To them, our air might be as dense as water is to us. They aren't exactly flying through our sky. They're navigating a different medium entirely, and sometimes their anchors get caught on our reality. Finally, for the absurdity files, we have Judge Lawrence A. Byrne of Arkansas. In April 1897, he saw a peculiar craft anchored on the ground, manned by 3 men speaking a foreign language. You know what his only description of them was? He said that based on their looks, one would, and I quote, "take them to be Japs." This is peak 19th century logic. You see an interdimensional craft that defies the laws of gravity, and your best guesses must be the Japanese. It shows the functioning lie works because we're always desperate to categorize the infinite into something we saw in last week's newsfeed. Then there's the mystery of the sky anchor, and this is kind of like a historical glitch. On April 26, 1897, in Merkel, Texas, people returning from church saw a heavy object being dragged along the ground by a rope attached to an airship. The anchor got caught on a railroad rail. A small man in a light blue sailor suit climbed down the rope, saw the crowd, cut the rope, and the ship sailed off. Vallee then connects this to a miracle from 1211 AD in Cloera, Ireland. I hope you see the similarity in both the stories. And in 2026 we talk about transmedium travel, UAPs moving from water to air. But 800 years ago, they didn't have that vocabulary. They just saw a guy swimming in the sky. It suggests that the atmosphere of Magonia might be physically different from ours, or that they're projecting a reality that our brains can only interpret through the technology of the time, whether that's a wooden ship or a 19th century airship. I know I keep going back to 1897, but there was another case where Captain James Hooton met a pilot in the Arkansas brush who was wearing smoked glasses. The pilot was tinkering with a ship and explained that they used condensed air and aeroplanes for propulsion. When the craft took off, it made a hissing sound and disappeared from sight in less time than it took to tell this story. Condensed air? In 1897, that sounded like cutting-edge sci-fi. Today, it sounds like someone trying to explain a smartphone to an ancient peasant by saying it's a magic rock with lightning inside. The entities have always used the language of the era to describe things that are clearly beyond it. For me, Vallee's conclusion about the segment was pretty crazy. He said the airship was a lie so well engineered that it could sink into human consciousness and then be forgotten, just like the supernatural beings of the Middle Ages. The phenomenon is a chameleon. It changes its secondary attributes, the shapes of the ships, the clothes of the occupants, to fit the cultural environment it's being projected onto. It's so crazy to me that it's 2026 and it seems like we're still being fooled by the latest mask. Whether it's literally a TikTok-shaped craft or a bearded man in a sailor suit asking for water from a well, the phenomenon is just a mirror reflecting our own expectations back at us. Personally, after years of wondering, I've stopped asking, what are they? And started asking things like, why do they want us to think they need cold chisels? Now I want to move away from the polite visitors asking for tools and into the deeper, darker woods of the phenomenon. This is where the hair on my arms always starts to stand up. Vallee makes a point that is absolutely central to the weirdness of this book. Modern alien encounters are almost identical to medieval accounts of demons. In the 15th century, people called them incubi or devils. Today, we call them extraterrestrials. But the theater of the event, the physical trauma and the weirdly specific experiments, that hasn't changed in 500 years. Let's look at a case that Vallee considers remarkable, which happened in the central region of France on May 20th, 1950. A woman was walking home to prepare dinner when she was suddenly enveloped in a blinding light. Out of nowhere, two huge black hands with no visible arms appeared. They didn't just touch her, they seized her with violence and squeezed her head. In her words, as a bird of prey rushes on its victim. She reported feeling a chest that was cold and felt like iron. As she was being dragged along, she heard the entity laugh, a strange laugh that sounded like it was coming through water. The entity spoke in a rough, sharply cut voice to an accomplice she couldn't see, saying, "There she is, we've got her." When she finally escaped, her face was marked with large red bars from the fingers, and the local police found that the brambles where she was dragged were black and scorched. It's not like they were conducting a nice, polite, scientific survey from a neighboring planet. They straight up kidnapped her, and by they I mean a creature that sounds more like a Victorian ghost story than a traveler from the stars. Why the iron chest? Why the laugh through water? It's as if they're wearing human suits that don't quite fit the physics of our world. I think in our current perspective, we might look at this through the lens of holographic interference, or a glitch in the simulation. It's like the rendering of the entity wasn't fully completed, leaving just the hands and a metallic-sounding chest. Our ancestors didn't have VR glitches, so I guess that's why they call them demons. The navel needle and the medieval calendar actually blew my mind. Everyone knows the Betty and Barney Hill case from 1961, basically the gold standard of abduction stories. Under hypnosis, Betty reported that the leader of the entities inserted a long needle into her navel, claiming it was a pregnancy test. Vallee points out a crazy historical coincidence. A 15th century French calendar called the Calendrier des Bergers contains woodcuts showing the tortures inflicted by demons on their victims. In these images, the demons are depicted piercing the abdomens of humans with long needles, in the exact same way reported by Betty Hill. You have to laugh at the medical evolution here. In 1450, it's a torture to steal your soul. In 1961, the test to check your biology. It's the same needle. The Magonian Medical Board clearly hasn't updated its equipment in 6 centuries. They're like the one doctor who still uses a wooden stethoscope because it just works. Unfortunately, we can't talk about the physical horror without the weirdly consistent sexual theme. Vallee highlights the 1957 case of Antonio Villas-Boas in Brazil. Antonio was in his tractor when he was taken aboard a craft and forced into a physical encounter with a blonde woman with large, cat-like blue eyes. Afterward, she pointed to her belly and then to the sky, implying she would have his child up there. Vallee connects this directly to the 17th century theologian, Father Sinistrari, what a crazy name, who was one of the highest authorities on human psychology in the Catholic Church. Sinistrari wrote extensively about the incubus phenomenon, where non-human entities sought carnal union with humans. Sinistrari described a woman named Hieronyma, who was haunted by an invisible lover who would appear as a young boy with sea-green eyes. When she resisted him, he would strike her and leave bruises and marks on her body that would vanish after a few days. Whether it's a Brazilian farmer or a 17th century Italian woman, the others seem obsessed with our genetics. Vallee suggests that the phenomenon might have a genetic context, that they're essentially farming us or crossbreeding with us to maintain a connection to our physical world. I find it hilarious that we think we're the ones exploring space when Vallee's data suggests that we're basically livestock for a parallel dimension that sometimes drops by for a sample. Lately, we're seeing a massive rise in biological engineering and AI-generated people who look perfectly real. It makes you wonder if the blonde woman Antonio saw was just a 1950s version of a deep fake. A physical projection designed to get the job done without revealing the true and probably terrifying form of the Magonians. Vallee's point is pretty clear. We aren't being visited by scientists from another planet. We're being interacted with by the gentry, a class of beings that has always been here, always been physical, and always been terrifyingly interested in our bodies. Let's talk about the weirdest physical property of Magonia, the fact that time doesn't pass there as it does here. This resonates with me because we're all living in a post-linear world anyway, but Vallee shows us that the relativity of time was a part of our folklore centuries before Einstein was even a glimmer in his parents' eyes. Vallee takes us back to 1825 in Wales to the story of Rhys and Llewellyn. They were walking home when Rhys heard music that Llewellyn couldn't hear. Rhys insisted on staying to dance for 5 minutes, while Llewellyn took the horses home. Llewellyn was eventually jailed on suspicion of murdering Rhys, but a farmer skilled in fairy matters suggested they go back to the spot. Llewellyn put his foot on the edge of a fairy ring, heard the harps, and saw Rhys dancing with the little people. When they pulled Rhys out of the circle, his first question was, "Where are the horses?" He believed he had been dancing for less than 5 minutes, but he had actually been gone for a year. the most tragic, weird detail, he became sad, fell ill, and died soon after. And this might just seem like a European thing, but Vallee finds the same theme in ancient Chinese folklore. Wang Qi goes into the mountains, finds some old men playing chess, and watches the game. One of the men gives him a date stone to keep in his mouth so he doesn't feel hunger or thirst. I would not put an old man's date stone in my mouth. Gross. After a while, they tell him to go home. He goes to pick up his axe and finds that the handle has turned to dust. When he returns to his village, he realizes centuries have passed. Imagine the modern version of this. You step into a weird glowing elevator at a conference or in an apartment building, talk to some guy in a light blue sailor suit for 5 minutes about condensed air, and when you step out, your iPhone is a museum piece, and they're rebooting Harry Potter for a 3rd time. Now let's try to connect this to the modern UFO era. Vallee brings up the creepy case of Private First Class Jerry Irwin in 1959. Irwin saw a glowing object, thought it was a plane crash, and left a note on his car, "Have gone to investigate possible plane crash." He even wrote "stop" on the side of his car with shoe polish so people would find him. When he was found unconscious 90 minutes later and taken to a hospital, he woke up and asked, "Were there any survivors?" To him, it was still 1959, but his memory was a total blank. Later, he fainted again and woke up asking the same question, only to find out it was now nearly a month later. The weirdest thing, more high strangeness, he later felt a powerful urge to return to the spot, where he found a piece of paper he had hidden in a bush, burned it, and then walked away, eventually being listed as a deserter and never seen again. Okay, I realized that last story didn't make much sense. I need to look more into it. But if you think losing a few hours in the Utah desert is bad, let's look at the Vidals. In June 1968, a couple was driving in Argentina when they were suddenly enveloped in a thick cloud of mist. They fell asleep, and when they woke up, their car was on a dirt road in an entirely different country, Mexico. They had lost 48 hours of their lives and were now on a different continent. But the craziest thing, I know I keep saying the weirdest part, but this is so crazy to me. The paint on their car, a Peugeot 403, had entirely vanished. Imagine the insurance claim. "Yes, I'd like to report a theft." "No, not the car. The color of the car. Also, I'm in Mexico now." It's as if the rendering of their vehicle couldn't survive the trip through whatever shortcut the Magonians took. Vallee connects this to the ancient story of Ossian, or Oisin. He was a young man taken to the legendary land of Tirnanog by its queen. He thought he had been there for thrice 7 days, but when he asked to return, the queen told him he had been gone for thrice 7 years. She gave him a black horse and a terrifying warning: "Do not dismount." As soon as an incident forced him to get off that horse and touch the soil of our world, the years he had skipped hit him all at once. He instantly turned into a feeble, blind, and helpless old man. I guess that's a good Magonian physics lesson. In Magonia, you're essentially buffered. You aren't aging because you aren't in our time stream, but the second you touch down back in our reality, the universe's server synchronizes, and you pay the debt in full. It's high stakes, the floor is lava, but the lava is just Tuesday. Whether it's the paint of a car in 1968 or the wood of an axe in ancient China, Magonia seems to have a way of eating the physical integrity of our world. It's as if our matter is too slow or heavy for their dimension. And I'm starting to think missing time is actual physical erosion, not just a symptom of this interaction. I don't think we can talk about time travel without the hills. Vallee notes that after their 1961 encounter, they couldn't account for a time gap of 2 hours. They had driven 35 miles but couldn't remember a single second of it until hypnosis revealed they had been taken. Barney's description of the leader is pure Magonia. The entity's mouth was just a horizontal line that would part slightly as they made a mumming sound. In modern physics discussions, we talk about time dilation near high-mass objects or at near-light speeds, but Vallee's cases suggest that Magonia isn't necessarily far away in space. It's a parallel universe that coexists with our own. If you step into their territory, you're stepping out of our time stream entirely. I know I'm bringing this up out of order, but there's this detail that stuck out to me in the Antonio Villalobos case. The thing is, he saw this clock inside a craft in 1957. He said it looked like an alarm clock with a glass top, but it had only one hand, and although time was passing, the hand didn't move. Vallee connects this to the poet who had a white clock without hands in his room, bearing the words, "It is later than you think." This suggests that in Magonia, time isn't a measurement, it's more of a theatrical setting. The entities project a scene that fits our era, whether it's a fairy ring or a spaceship, but the one thing they can't quite sync up is the clock. When you enter Magonia, you're entering a theory of apparitions, where the apparent absurdity just serves as a trigger for our brains. I've realized that missing time isn't because they're doing complex surgery on us. It's because our reality is a subroutine, and when the Magonians drag the anchor of their world across ours, our local clock seems to simply stop ticking. We aren't being abducted by aliens as much as we're being taken by the wind into a place where 5 minutes of dancing is a death sentence. Another thing I've been thinking about is that the Magonian theater department doesn't just do sci-fi. They're world-class at religious epics. In Passport to Magonia, Vallee argues that the same mechanism behind UFO landings is responsible for some of history's most famous religious apparitions. To the Magonians, a spaceship and a miracle are just different costumes for the same functioning lie designed to shape human destiny. Let's look at the miracle in the tiny village of Knock, Ireland. In 1879, during a torrential downpour, 15 people saw a group of figures standing in a golden and sparkling light that made a gable of the church look like a wall of snow. They saw the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, Saint John the Evangelist, complete with a mitre on his head and a large open book in his hand. For me, an important detail here is the physics. A witness named Bridget Trench tried to embrace the Virgin's feet, but her hands found nothing but the wall. More bizarrely, while the rain was pouring down everywhere else, the ground under the apparition and the wall itself remained perfectly dry. This is a classic Magonian rendering error. It's as if the entity set up a high-def holographic stage, but forgot to include the weather effects. They had the mitre and the golden light ready to go, but they accidentally left a no-rain bubble around the set. It's like a movie production where the background is a desert, but the lead actor is bone dry in a monsoon. In our modern context, this sounds like a localized reality field. If you've ever played a video game where one specific area has different physics than the rest of the map, you know exactly what Bridget Trench was dealing with. Vallee calls this the theory of apparitions, suggesting that the phenomenon triggers high-level perception patterns directly in the witness's brain. Vallee then takes us back to 1531 in Mexico, to the famous case of Juan Diego. Before the Virgin appeared, Diego heard a concert of singing birds, sharp and sweet. He saw a girl, about 14 years old, who was wonderfully beautiful. Notice the recurring pattern again. She's young, beautiful, and radiant, the same archetype as the blonde woman with the cat-like eyes who abducted Antonio Villalobos in 1957. Diego was given out-of-season roses as a sign, which turned into a permanent image on his cloak. Vallee points out that these miraculous signs, whether they are roses in winter or space medals left in a field, are all part of the same genetic and cultural context. Vallee's bold here. He says the features of these miracles, the strange globe of light, the luminous entities, the absence of rain, and the miraculous cures, are identical to those in modern UFO phenomena. Whether it's a girl in Brazil being cured of cancer by men who came from the sky, or a deaf child being cured at Knock, the Magonians are using biological compatibility to interact with us. I know I sound like a crazy person, but I see the theater clearly now. In 1531 they needed roses and a beautiful girl to convert a continent. In 1897 they needed a bearded man in a light blue sailor suit asking for tools to freak out Texas. In 2026 we're still waiting for the aliens to land on the White House lawn, not realizing that they've already been here, standing in the rain at a church in Ireland, staying perfectly dry while we get soaked. Vallee concludes that the phenomenon is a chameleon, as I mentioned before. It keeps adapting its appearance to our culture. If we expect angels, we get angels. If we expect astronauts, we get astronauts. The truth is that they're stage managers, and we're the audience that keeps falling for the props. And if you thought the 1897 airships were a comedy, and the Black Hands were a horror movie, I think this part is where this whole thing becomes a dark, interdimensional romance. As the idiot that I am, I have to ask, what if the visitors aren't here for our gold or our water, but for our DNA? Vallee spends a significant portion of the book exploring the genetic context of the UFO myth, arguing that these beings have been trying to interbreed with us for centuries. I already mentioned Father Sinistrari in the 1600s, who was a high-ranking theologian dealing with Hieronima, the woman who was pursued for years by an incubus. When she rejected him, the entity didn't leave. And I know I'm talking about it again, but once, apparently, this incubus built a wall of flat stones around her bed so high that she and her husband needed a ladder to get out. Another strange detail involves a dinner party Hieronyma's husband threw for military friends. While the guests were washing their hands, the entire dinner table vanished, along with the dishes and the wine. A few minutes later, the kitchen was suddenly full of new plates loaded with strange meal that the guests found delicious, though nobody felt hungry after eating it. This is like the ultimate toxic ex behavior. Imagine an entity so obsessed with you that he literally steals your furniture and replaces your catering with some interdimensional slop just to get your attention. It's like a supernatural soap opera. I have to wonder if our history books are just a catalog for a Magonian talent agency. Vallee cites the work of Maluenda, who confirms that children generated by these incubi entities aren't just normal kids. They're physically and temperamentally distinct. The sources state these offspring are consistently tall, very strong, very daring, very magnificent, and very wicked. Let's talk about the roster of hybrids. According to various classical and theological authors, many of the pillars of Western civilization were actually Magonian seeds planted in our timeline. There were Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. There was Plato. Yes, the father of Western thought was allegedly an interdimensional hybrid. Alexander the Great, who conquered the known world before he was 30. He also claimed to have done that with the help of his daimon, but we can talk about that another time. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Merlin, yes, Merlin, the ultimate mystic, said to be born of an incubus and a nun who was the daughter of Charlemagne. Martin Luther, the leader of the Reformation, was identified by his enemies as a heresiarch, born of this process. The stakes for this Hall of Fame are higher than just historical fame. We see that many theologians believe the Antichrist himself must be born through this process. Cardinal Bellarmine even suggested that the Antichrist would have qualities that will not be common to others because of this non-human parentage. I guess that's the ultimate interdimensional flex. If you want to control the simulation of human history, you don't just land a spaceship. You drop a tall and magnificent baby into a royal cradle or a philosopher's home and let the genetics do the work. We think we're following great men, but we might just be following a Magonian script written in DNA. It seems like we like to think we're being studied by advanced scientists, but like I said earlier, and Jacques Vallée suggests, we might just be a genetic resource. Whether it's a green-eyed boy in 1680 or a cat-eyed blonde in 1957, the goal appears to be the same: carnal union. It seems like these beings are biologically compatible with us and use us to maintain their own race or to foster their offspring. I know I sound insane. I can't believe I'm saying all of this. Who am I? And today, we're terrified of deepfakes and AI-generated partners. Vallee was basically warning us that the Magonians have been the original catfishers of history. They project an image that we find attractive, or at least biologically compelling, to get what they need. My realization here is that the gray alien is just the latest mask. Beneath the mask is a race that Father Sinistrari called the Gentry. Beings who aren't quite spirits and aren't quite human, but who are desperately interested in our physical bodies. In the Idiot Mystic Guide to the Universe, we have to address the fact that Magonia isn't just a place for tool-borrowing sailors or glowing saints. It has a very dark, very predatory side. Vallee reveals a long, chilling history of what folklore calls changelings, which I talked about in the fairy episode. Changelings are essentially the Magonian version of a fraudulent return policy. These entities are very active in stealing young children, and frequently take men, women, and especially pregnant women or young mothers. And when I talk about the substitution trick, I always get a stomachache. I don't know why. Sometimes, the little people would take a real human child and leave a changeling in its place, which was occasionally one of their own children, but more often it was just an enchanted object. The source describes parents finding a broomstick with rugs wrapped around it lying in the cradle, which had been magically disguised to look like their baby. Imagine the level of interdimensional gaslighting required to make a parent think a broomstick is their baby. This is the ultimate functioning lie. A prop left on the stage so the play can keep going while the lead actor is being kidnapped into a parallel world. Today, with high-tech surveillance, we talk about deepfakes, but the Magonians were doing analog deepfakes with literal kitchen cleaning supplies centuries ago. This also maps onto modern missing 411 theories about people vanishing in national parks under impossible circumstances. It's the same taken by the wind vibe that Vallee identifies in Irish folklore. If they thought you were a changeling, the remedy was as strange as the crime. To get a child back, parents in the north of Scotland would take the suspected elf to a known haunt of its race, usually a stone circle or a barrow, and lay it down with an offering of bread, butter, milk, cheese, eggs, and flesh or fowl. They would then retire for an hour or two, hoping that the Magonians would take the snacks and return the real kid. However, this folklore had a brutal real-world edge. The sources mention a case as late as May 17, 1884, where two women in Clonmel were arrested for cruelty to a 3-year-old because they believed he was a changeling and hoped that by ill-treating him, they could force the fairies to return the real child. That's messed up. This is the darkest version of customer service. You're standing in a stone circle with a plate of ham and cheese, essentially trying to negotiate a hostage release with a parallel dimension. I'll give you the eggs if you give me my son and take back this broomstick. But why do they do that? It's suggested the motive is purely genetic. The idea is that the gentry take human children to improve their own race. Even more specifically, they take human mothers to obtain milk and fostering care for their own offspring. For me, this ties everything back to the modern UFO invader myth. Vallee notes that modern rumors suggest that we have been infiltrated by extraterrestrials who differ from humans in small details only. This is just the 20th century version of the changeling. Whether it's an alien hybrid or an elf child, the narrative is still the same. Magonia is a parasitic dimension that needs our biology to survive, and they aren't above using a rug-wrapped broom to cover their tracks. There's a really interesting detail about how these entities manage human sight. In one account, a human nurse was taken to fairyland to suckle a babe. To allow her to see the wonders of their land, a lady dropped 3 drops of a precious dew onto the nurse's left eyelid. Suddenly, the woman could see the beautiful landscape of Magonia, but as soon as it was time to leave, the fairy passed a hand over her eye to restore its natural powers. This is kind of like a heads-up display. It doesn't sound like magic. It seems like they're literally software locking our vision. I wonder how much of modern life is actually a beautiful land watered with meandering rivulets that we just can't see because nobody has put the green dew on our eyelids lately. Vallee even cites Martin Luther, who once claimed that a certain man was a changeling or a kill crop and suggested he should be thrown into the river Moldau. When the heavyweights of the Protestant Reformation are giving you advice on how to drown interdimensional infiltrators, you know the weirdness levels have officially peaked. If you think European changelings are weird, we have to look at Mexico. In the study of the Tzotzils, they speak of the Ickles, beings from another world who fly with rocket-like things attached to the back. These guys are pretty prolific kidnappers. The women they carry off are said to bear children at an impossible rate, sometimes once a week or even daily. These offspring are described as entirely black, which sounds kind of racist, but I don't know. And they allegedly learn the art of flying inside their father's cave. A child a week? That's like a factory line. Imagine the parent-teacher conferences in Magonia. Your son is doing great at flying inside the cave, but he's really struggling with the not being a black rocket baby part of the curriculum. That still sounds racist. I don't know what's wrong with these stories. I don't know what was going on in the past, man. This connection is vital because it proves Vallee's point. Whether it's a kill crop in Germany or an ickle in Mexico, the goal is a genetic harvest. In this framework, they seem to be using our biology to produce a race of rocket-flying hybrids that live in caves and parallel dimensions. We are the fostering care for a race that is slowly, daily, building its own population right under our noses. The skin stuff made me a bit uncomfortable to say, but it is in the book, so check it out. If you've been paying any attention at all, you know by now that the gray alien has basically become the corporate logo of the unexplained. But as I've been digging through sources, I've realized that the entities in Magonia didn't always get the memo about the small gray uniform. It describes a literal monster menagerie. Beings that are so physically diverse that they put a Comic-Con to shame. Let's start with the case of Eugenio Douglas on October 12, 1963. Douglas was driving his truck in a hard rain when he saw a blinding light that forced him to stop. He saw a metallic craft, 35 feet high, and 3 figures who were over 12 feet tall. They were obviously huge, but they were also wearing strange headpieces with antennae-like attachments. When Douglas fired his revolver at them, they hit him with a ray of red light that actually burned him. Burns a doctor later compared to ultraviolet radiation. But here's another interesting detail. As Douglas ran toward a nearby village, the red light followed him and interfered with the streetlights, turning them violet and green. Even inside a nearby house, the candles and electric lights turned green, and a pungent gas filled the air. As you can see, they're not just burning you, they're changing the aesthetic of your entire neighborhood. And the footprints they left behind? Nearly 20 inches long. Whatever those cosmic skis were, the rain conveniently washed away all the footprints before serious scientists could show up. I forgot to say that happened in Argentina. Later that same year in Brazil, 3 boys saw a sphere hovering above trees. A 10-foot-tall being descended on 2 beams of light as if he were on an elevator. This guy's fashion sense was truly bizarre. He wore a transparent helmet with a dark eye in the middle of his forehead, and his garment inflated the second he touched the ground. He wore tall boots equipped with triangular spikes that left deep impressions in the soft dirt. The thing that gets me is the way this entity walked. The boy said he moved with his back stiff, his legs open, and his arms outstretched, swaying from side to side like he was trying to find his balance on a rock. Inside the sphere, the boys could see other occupants turning knobs and flicking switches like they were in a low-budget 1950s control room. Contrast these giants with the occupants of the 1897 airships. Witnesses then didn't see 12-foot giants. They saw hideous people or children jabbering together. In Arkansas, a witness met a man with a long, dark beard and a woman holding an umbrella. They were filling a sack with water and invited the witness for a ride to a place where it does not rain. This sounds like the uncanny valley effect we talk about nowadays. The Magonians aren't aliens, they're projections. Sometimes the projection is a 12-foot giant with antennae, and sometimes it's a bearded guy with an umbrella. Vallee suggests they are an absolutely consistent tradition that simply changes its secondary attributes, as I mentioned before. By the 1950s, the Magonians were leaning into the diver aesthetic. In 1954, an Italian farmer in Libya saw an egg-shaped craft and men in yellowish coveralls wearing gas masks. One took his mask off to reveal a normal human face before blowing into a tube. Why gas masks in the desert? It's as if the Magonian prop department is just grabbing whatever looks high-tech for the decade and running with it. Apparently, they're performing a carefully engineered scene just to see how we react. In April 1950, an Italian witness named Bruno Ficini entered a craft that looked like a giant beehive. He saw beings roughly 5 feet 9 inches tall, dressed in gray diving suits with transparent glass in front of their faces and flexible pipes at their mouths. They wore earphones and appeared to be busy with a soldering operation that produced sparks. When Ficini offered to help, they beamed a light at him that threw him through the air. But why would a civilization capable of interdimensional travel need a soldering iron? It's as if they're performing a repair just so we have a story to tell. Even more bizarre, they left behind metal fragments that were found to be an anti-friction material, highly resistant to heat. It's a physical clue left on the stage to make us think we're dealing with nuts and bolts. If we go back to the airship wave, we find Captain James Hooton, who saw a man in smoked glasses tinkering with a craft. The ship had 3 large wheels on each side made of a bending metal that became concave as they moved. The keel was divided into 2 parts, terminating in a knife-like edge. The pilot claimed they used condensed air for propulsion. Bending metal wheels and condensed air. It's the ultimate 1890s sci-fi aesthetic. The Magonians were essentially cosplaying as steampunk engineers because that was the cutting edge of our imagination at the time. Vallee notes that the occupants fall into several distinct biological categories. While we focus on the giants, the archives also include entities that literally fly without the need for a craft, like winged creatures. Beings that are identical to the gnomes of medieval theory, with deep, old voices. Sylphs, beings with human complexions but oversized heads and silvery voices. I think the most startling detail is that almost all these beings, from the 12-foot giants to the sylphs, are described as having no breathing apparatus. They aren't aliens worried about our oxygen. They're apparitions that exist in a state of high-level perception. I've realized the menagerie isn't a list of species, but rather a wardrobe of costumes that the same underlying force keeps changing into. So, I don't normally talk about books like this, but we've reached the part where I stop laughing at 12-foot giants, and I seem to have realized that the joke is actually on us, or me. This is the grand reveal of Jacques Vallée's work. The thing I've already mentioned a few times, the theory of the functioning lie. Vallee argues that the UFO phenomenon isn't just a series of random visits. It's a control system designed to shape human imagination and, by extension, our collective destiny. Vallee states that the mechanisms behind religious miracles, fairy faith, and UFO landings are identical. I think I've already said this 3 times, but the phenomenon is a chameleon. It changes its secondary attributes, the shape of the ships, the clothes of the occupants, to fit the cultural environment into which it's projected. Think about the 1897 airships. Vallee points out that while they were believable to the people of the 19th century, they are no longer credible to us. He argues they were specifically designed to deceive potential witnesses. This is a pretty sobering realization. It's not like we're looking at advanced technology. What we're looking at is just a prop. The airship was a lie so well engineered that it could sink into our collective consciousness, be forgotten, and yet still leave a permanent mark on our culture. Why is it always so weird? Vallée's Proposition 4 says the behavior of these entities is consistently absurd, and their appearance is ludicrous. He suggests this absurdity has a very practical goal. It keeps professional scientists away from the area where the activity is happening. If a story is too crackpot, serious people won't investigate it, which allows the phenomenon to continue its work on our subconscious undisturbed. It's the ultimate high-level trolling. Imagine a civilization so advanced they've mastered interdimensional travel, and they use it to act like jabbering children, or bearded guys with umbrellas, just to make sure NASA doesn't take notes. It's like a genius hacker who leaves a "your mom" joke in the code, just to distract the security team. In our modern world, we see this everywhere in information warfare and social media algorithms. We are constantly fed absurd or polarizing content that shapes our worldviews without us ever realizing we're being steered. Vallee was looking at this narrative engineering decades before we had a name for it. He saw the Magonians as the original masters of the deep fake. Vallee's Proposition 1 is a reality check for our ego. The behavior of a superior race coexisting with us would not necessarily appear purposeful to us. In fact, the organized action of a superior race must appear absurd to an inferior one. We keep asking, what do they want, as if they are human politicians. But lately I've been thinking of them more as narrative architects. They aren't interested in our leaders, they're interested in our imagination. By exposing us to these carefully engineered scenes, they move the needle of human belief. They moved us from believing in wood spirits to believing in Martians, and who knows where they're taking us next. Finally, Passport to Magonia suggests that the mystery is a myth that could be used for political or sociological purposes. Vallee notes that to control human imagination is to shape mankind's collective destiny. Whether they are the gentry stealing a child, or aliens performing a medical test. They are biologically compatible with us and are deeply woven into our history. The functioning lie is more of a mechanism than it is a mistake. It's a way for a parallel world to anchor itself to ours, dragging its rope across our reality and occasionally catching on a railroad in Texas, just to see if we're still paying attention. So here we are in 2026. I finally closed the book that my teenage self stared at in wonder for all those years. It turns out the iconic cover wasn't a map to another planet. It was a passport to Magonia, a map to a country that occupies the same space we do, but operates on a completely different set of physical and temporal laws. The greatest lesson I've learned from Vallee, a man trusted by NASA to solve the unsolvable, is that we need to stop looking for aliens and start looking at the mechanism instead. Vallee argues that the search for nuts and bolts spaceships is as futile as the medieval search for the physical kingdom of the fairies. We're dealing with a chameleon-like phenomenon that projects whatever secondary attributes our current culture is prepared to handle. I've said it 1,000 times, but the phenomenon is a functioning lie. It isn't trying to be real in the way we want it to be. It uses absurdity and ludicrous behavior, like 12-foot giants or sailors asking for tools, as a deliberate way to keep professional scientists away. I took a lot away from this reading, and I understand why it's such a prolific book. From Vallee's perspective, this appears to be a control system. These visitations are a way to shape our destiny by steering our beliefs. According to him, UFOs might not be objects at all, but windows into a parallel universe that materialize and dematerialize at will. Apparently, we're witnesses to a carefully engineered scene, whether we see a holy lamp in a fairy knoll or a control console in a sphere. We're seeing a prop designed for our era. My teenage self wanted to find a ship that could take me away from Earth, but the adult idiot mystic realizes, thanks to Vallee, that the others are already here. They are the gentry, the good people, and the pilots who have been coexisting with us for centuries. We aren't being visited by travelers from across the stars. We're being managed by narrative engineers from right next door. As Vallee beautifully concludes, we're observing folklore in the making, gathering material at the deepest source of human imagination. We ignore the absurdity, we miss the point. The weirdness is the message. As I wrap up this TLDR, I'm reminded of the lines Vallee uses to end his own masterpiece. I took it for a fairy vision, a journey like the path to heaven, and I'm still just trying to find them. This has been Idiot Mystic. Keep your eyes on the sky, but keep your tools under lock and key. You never know who might just stop by to borrow a cold chisel.